Welcome to the Hughes, Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigation Practice Group's podcast, All Things Investigations. The Hughes, Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigation Practices Group represents many of the premier companies around the world, providing advice on issues spanning the full anti-corruption and compliance spectrum. In this podcast, host Tom Fox and members of the Hughes, Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Practice Group will highlight some of the key legal issues involved in white-collar and other investigations, both domestically and internationally. We will tackle topical issues involved in investigations, as well as explore how companies can prevent and detect issues that arise in conducting investigations on a worldwide basis. Today, Mike DeBernardis joins me to take a look at the recently released Gunvor and Trafigura FCPA enforcement actions, and we data mine these cases for lessons learned for the compliance professional. I know you'll enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back with another episode of the award-winning All Things Investigations. Back again with Mike DeBernardis. Mike, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Happy to be back. It's been a little while.
Mike, we've had a couple of fairly significant FCPA enforcement actions since you and I have had a chance to visit. The first one involving a company called Gunvor. The second one is a company that I call Trafigura, being a good Southerner with my Texas enunciation of the first syllable being the most important in any word. But they were both Swiss trading companies. Both came to grief for their bribery and corruption in trading activities. Some of the bribery schemes were fairly pedestrian, but some were pretty sophisticated. So I wanted to maybe see if we could just visit about these cases today and see if we could draw some lessons learned for the compliance professional.
Sounds good. Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff kind of packed in here. And obviously these two are part of the much broader attack on the commodities trading industry overall over the last several years. And I use that term attack very jokingly there, but
could we amend it to industry sweep?
Yeah, we can. We could. They don't like that term, but yes, we can do that.
That's why I like it so much. Let's start with Gunvor, because here we had a pretty sophisticated multi-year in bribery and corruption. What did you maybe set the stage for us here?
Sure, and you're right. This is multi-year. I think. Depending on how you calculate it, anyway from 9 to 10 years of bribery scheme here for Gunvor, focusing on Ecuador and really Petroecuador. This scheme really arose, and it's primarily one scheme that evolved into a second, but really arose out of a program that Petroecuador put in place, which was loan for oil, or oil-backed loans. With state-owned, unnamed state-owned entities, foreign from Ecuador, which would, in a sense, purchase oil. I mean, they're really loaning money in return for oil, and Gunvor and other traders had an interest in this because they can play a vital role in that exchange. And so Gunvor created a scheme using, not surprisingly, I think, comes as a surprise to no one, using a third party here, very prominent third party here, in order to sort of facilitate these contracts between the two different state-owned entities and Petroecuador, and obtain advantages by ultimately paying bribes back to Petroecuador officials for this. One of the interesting things here is that due to efforts of the Department of Justice to prosecute individuals involved, we know the players. I think it's a rare situation where we know at least the names and identities of some of the Gunvor employees. We know the names and identities of the consultants that were involved, and we know the names and identities of the recipients of the bribes, at least some of them from Petroecuador. So it's an interesting opportunity to kind of really see the whole picture and see it from various angles. I mean, this case, I think the Gunvor employee Raymond Kohat, I think his case started in 21. I think his indictment was from 2020. So this has been ongoing for some time. It's just kind of the final piece of it. But look, ultimately the scheme here was one we've seen over and over again, where Gunvor paid bribes through their third party intermediary, using shell companies and offshore companies. Some of the payments had correspondent bank accounts in the U.S., which is at least in New York, which is how this case ended up in EDNY. And then those payments were ultimately routed to the Petroecuador officials for these, help facilitate these contracts between the state-owned entities and Petroecuador. And then at the end of the scheme, I think once Mr. Arias, who was the Petroecuador official who was receiving the bribes, once he left Petroecuador, the scheme changed slightly and seemed to actually, based on my reading of the plea agreement, seemed to maybe get a little lower level, but it adjusted to paying bribes in cash to Petroecuador officials for confidential information that might help Gunvor in its bids.
Mike, there were several interesting aspects, I thought, in terms of what Gunvor did in their remediation, cooperation, and lack of self-disclosure, which is something we've harped on several podcasts, self-disclosure and the failure to do so, or here we had the failure to do so. Anything interesting for you in the remediation that you think a compliance practitioner might be able to take away from this?
A couple things. One thing that we've talked about in the past, which now is, I don't know if it's because it's on top of mind because we've talked about it, or it's just more common now. But once again, in talking about the remediation, the DOJ noted sort of this change in business operation, right? That the company not only put in place compliance programs, but made changes to eliminate the use of third-party business origination agents. We've seen in the past, Albemarle or SAP, a kind of a broader change. We're not going to use third-party agents at all. This seems to be more specific, but arguably risk-based approach to sort of changing our business approach to lower our risk, which now companies are explicitly getting remediation credit for. And then the other thing that I noticed, because I think it goes hand in hand with that change, is updating its compensation policy and keeping an eye on incentives for internal people. Because if you are eliminating business origination agents external, you have taken away that risk, but you've really moved it internal. So now you've got internal people who are responsible for business origination, and you really have to think about the incentives and compensation structures for those people. And it seems that Gunvor did both.
One other thing I would add, this is not new, but the DOJ indicated that Gunvor implemented a business communications policy that addressed the use of ephemeral and encrypted messaging. And if anyone had ever wondered whether the SEC focus on that for regulated businesses and industries would move over to non-regulated, I think that question is now answered very strongly in the affirmative. So it's going to be a part of FCPA enforcement actions going forward. So I thought Gunvor really did an admirable job on the remediation. And I want to just say a few words again about self-disclosure, because even though there was no self-disclosure in this or the next case, I think it's just the language that the DOJ used really emphasize the importance they are putting on self-disclosures and the benefits that are available that Gunvor did not receive because they did not self-disclose. Could you maybe say a few words on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you look at what Gunvor did here in terms of both cooperation and remediation, they basically have done everything that could be expected, and we'll see as we talk about their ultimate resolution or the fine. They got basically as much credit as they could have gotten without self-disclosing, and I think we're now seeing that in very stark terms, the difference, the numbers in terms of when you disclose and when you don't disclose. Now, I will say here, it's unclear whether actually there would have been an opportunity for Gunvor to self-disclose because it looks like the conduct ran up until 2020. And as I mentioned, the Gunvor employee, Mr. Kohat, that there was this sealed indictment dated August 2020. So it's possible that the DOJ found out about this information before Gunvor did itself, or before the compliance investigations team did. But it's dark. I mean, you can go through the numbers and really you can put a value on it, which I think is really interesting now, being able to say at a minimum, lack of self-disclosure costs $50 million, $100 million. That is a really impactful way to incentivize disclosure, is when you can, on case after case, put a minimum value on what it could be worth.
Mike, I know you have been part of discussions with clients around self-disclosure or not, and I've always maintained it is perhaps one of the most difficult decisions a board would have to make because of everything that would flow from that. Do you think that this case, Trafigura, and really the series of cases where the DOJ has emphasized self-disclosure move the needle towards greater self-disclosure because you can quantify the benefit? I don't want to say it's not as difficult as it was before, but as the DOJ, you think really moving the needle because it's given us a range that we can tell clients this is what you can potentially save?
I think it's a great question. I think it is still an incredibly difficult question. What it's done is given boards of directors, executives, more concrete data to show the benefits, right? And there was some, we can do, especially when the pilot program and then corporate enforcement policy were first announced. We can get an additional 10% off, or maybe we can get a declination, or we can get this or that. Now that time has passed and we've seen time and time again the credit given and the sort of difference in potential criminal penalty for self-disclosure or not, those data points are really impactful in the discussion, and it makes it more of a concrete discussion about the benefits rather than some sort of hypothetical discussion. So I don't know whether it's moved the needle. I probably need more data on my side to know whether it's actually moved the needle, but it has made those discussions more specific, and I think has made it easier for decision makers, boards of directors and others, to understand in concrete ways the benefits of self-disclosure.
Let's turn to Trafigura, which came out a couple of weeks ago. This was another commodity traders in oil trading, this time dealing with Petrobras in Brazil. Once again, we had a long list of individuals who were involved, both from the Trafigura side and the Petrobras side. You want to maybe set the stage on this one a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, a similar situation in that in general the scheme is consistent with what we've come to expect and enjoy. Yeah, but with some nuance here that you and I know have discussed. So this was more a little less complex with this sort of than Gunvor with the oil-backed loan situation, and more just consultants paying bribes in return for Petrobras contracts. I did find one thing kind of interesting here is that there seemed to have been a good amount of movement from individuals who at one point served as consultants for Trafigura, moving into employment executive roles at the company, or individuals who worked at Petrobras moving into, and then all of them sort of maintained roles in the scheme, just different roles as they moved throughout, between being an external consultant, an internal employee, or working for as a Petrobras trader. So ultimately, the scheme worked in that Trafigura agreed to pay a fee per barrel on the contract. So I think it was 20%. At one point, it's 10 to 20%, but it really averaged out to be about a 20% fee per barrel of oil in each Petrobras contract as a bribe. These contracts are large. The price per oil varies. I don't track it carefully, but let's say 60 to 100 and change dollars per barrel. So 20% or 20 cents per barrel does not seem like a large amount, but we're talking about millions of barrels. Those numbers add up, and then ultimately the money was paid back through sham contracts. One of the more interesting pieces to this, and I think one of the ways that this scheme was really pretty complex, is that due to some internal movement of Trafigura executives, one of the executives involved in the scheme ended up in Singapore after some different restructurings or promotions, and facilitated the scheme by arranging for a sham contract between Singapore and a Hong Kong consultancy ostensibly related to some China work. And this generated cash as the consultant executed fake invoices, which were then used to pay bribes in Brazil. But if you are a Trafigura compliance professional, or even on the investigation team, it would be very difficult to draw this nexus to connect the dots between this consultant in Hong Kong who had nothing to do with any of the work in Brazil, and this Brazilian bribery scheme. So it really shows some of the sophistication here.
Let me pick up on that last point and maybe talk about the employees involved as well a little bit, because I absolutely agree with you. I used to be in the energy industry, and there was no way I could determine if a 20-cent surcharge on a barrel of oil was unreasonable. There's just no way a compliance professional, or probably even a trader, because they're maybe on the spot market where it may be $120 a barrel. Number one. Number two was the disparate business units involved. Typically, a compliance professional would look for an anomaly of payment to a third party, and that's what we're trained to do. But here they were funding the bribes literally internally. And there's just almost no way, unless you had an auditor who happened to audit both business units and stumbled upon it. And I say stumble because I can't think of a way they would ever connect a fraudulent payment in Singapore, Asia Pacific, or whatever business unit that is, with a bribe in Brazil. But also, I would like compliance professionals to think about the employees. And you touched on this group of people. They move from third-party consultants to Trafigura employees. We had Petrobras employees moving to work for Trafigura. We had two executives at the company itself. We used to joke in the energy industry, don't be ugly to people you work for, because they or work over or supervise, because you may work for them one day. Well, that happened here.
Right.
And so we had two executives involved in the bribery scheme in Brazil. Well, one of those moves to Singapore. So I began to wonder, does a compliance professional need to have visibility into sort of employee hires and employee moves and employees leaving the company and going to a customer? Is that an anomaly? I mean, it's not illegal, obviously, in and of itself, but is it raise a red flag? Perhaps. But how does compliance have visibility into that? You would typically never have visibility into it. Does that mean every high-risk business unit, you need to have visibility into the operations side? Is that one more thing a compliance professional needs to look at? It really, any thoughts on that part of all of this?
So it's incredibly difficult. One of the low-hanging fruit there is obviously hires directly from a customer, especially from a state-owned customer. So people coming from Petrobras and then either becoming a consultant for the company or an employee of the company. There needs to be a role there for compliance to sort of vet that from various different angles. One is is this move itself a repayment of some improper advantage that the individual offered while he was a government official. But also, what are the other risks involved, right? When somebody moves from a government role like that, especially these traders moves from a government role like that to a role with the company, who are his colleagues left behind? What's that relationship like? Is it anything that's so close as to potentially be problematic? And so I think that's the easy answer to the question is that they should be involved in those. The other answer to the question is really difficult, Tom. And I think, yes, you could take a risk-based approach, but trying to keep track of that in real time is virtually impossible. Now, I think from an investigation perspective, from an internal investigation perspective, what is very smart is to follow the people, right? So you had somebody involved in Brazil, two folks involved in the Brazil activity. One of them moves to Singapore, not just assuming that, okay, well, he's out of the scheme, then he's moved on to Singapore and is out, and sort of following that, seeing not only did that individual stay involved in this Brazilian scheme that we're looking at, but did he initiate any other schemes in Singapore, right? So that really goes to sort of scoping your investigation and how that changes on the fly. But sort of keeping track of those moving parts on a proactive basis and a preventative basis is I think an impossible ask.
I'm not sure you've used that phrase in any podcast we have ever done. Quote, impossible ask, end quote. We may, maybe we could write a whole sort of series around impossible asks. Mike, I'd like to maybe end our podcast today focusing on three common areas I see from both cases and get your thoughts. The first one is around the DOJ's use of either culture or prior conduct. I think we're beginning to see that come into focus a little bit. Could you maybe give us what your thoughts were on both cases regarding that aspect that's relatively new in the DOJ's assessment of corporate conduct?
Yeah, for sure. I think that is now coming into focus. It's not explicit, but you can really see what they're trying to do, which is, and this is in the last year and a half, 2 years, been a focus, right? And been a topic of a lot of conversation is we're going to pay attention to past misconduct that is going to impact your ultimate penalty. And it's been a question is how they can actually do it. I think what we're seeing is whatever discount percentage a company receives is reflective of their remediation and cooperation credit. So for Gunvor, for example, that was 25%. They received a 25% discount for their remediation and cooperation, which I believe was the maximum they could have received, considering that they didn't self-disclose. Where they're taking into consideration past misconduct, it seems, is the starting point for that discount. So the best place for a company is, right, to have that discounted from the low end of the sentencing guidelines. Instead, Gunvor, in part, it seems, due to a not so distant bribery scheme that they resolved with Swiss authorities, their starting point was the 30th percentile. So 30% up from the low end of the sentencing guidelines range, and that's where they applied the 25% discount. And similar to Trafigura, who got a lower discount, right, 10%, because of issues the DOJ noted with both the cooperation and remediation, at least at the beginning of the investigation. So it was a 10% discount, and they had a few more remote, both in time and subject matter, past misconducts, 2010 time frame, that they got their 10% discount was applied to the 5th percentile. So what it seems we're seeing now is the DOJ sort of incorporating that past misconduct into where the starting point for the discount.
So the next thing I'd like to raise with you is, or rather consistent from both cases, is something we'd seen over multiple other FCPA enforcement actions, which was the lack of an external monitor. And up into the Gunvor case, we saw language, I thought, which explained the DOJ's position. In Trafigura, we did not, I at least didn't see that language. And so I'm beginning to wonder, is monitorships, or at least external monitorships, becoming less important due to the increased importance of companies reporting to the Department of Justice directly, or is maybe something else that you're seeing in this?
What we can say for sure is that they're less common than they used to be. Right? I think there's probably several factors to that. You and I have talked about in the past. Companies are smarter, and they're smarter at being proactive. Once an investigation starts, putting in place compliance enhancements, reporting those to the DOJ during the course of the investigation, kind of doing that early engagement between the DOJ and compliance professionals at the company to give comfort that a monitor might not be necessary. I think there's also the possibility that the DOJ is very comfortable with its own resources and sort of evaluating compliance programs, and having these enhanced reporting requirements is sufficient in more cases than not. I have the same, I think, frustration that you did, which is that it wasn't clear, at least in Trafigura, how this analysis was done. If you look at the sort of considerations, the factors as to when a monitor's appropriate, this ticked off a few of those boxes. So I think in that sense was a good result for the company, not having to have a monitor for sure. So I think we can safely say, at least right now, we are in a space where the monitor in an FCPA resolution will be the exception. There's still a lot of work companies have to do to avoid one, but that is now a very achievable goal if you do the right things.
Mike, for a third point, I would like to raise with you the following. Starting with Albemarle, SAP, Gunvor, and now Trafigura, we've seen a move away from either external parties as a sales force or external parties as a business originator. And this is not something that was discussed in the FCPA Resource Guide, first or second edition. And it wasn't even discussed in the 2023 evaluation of corporate compliance programs. But it really raised for me a point that I've sort of anecdotally observed. I don't want to see if your thoughts on it, which is the following: that the Department of Justice is not static. It is dynamic in its views of a best practice compliance program, meaning they evolve. And they evolve not simply because the DOJ comes up with an idea, but they evolve because companies come up with an idea. But companies come up with ideas based upon their own risks and their assessment of their risk and their determination to manage those risks. And if that management is we're going to get rid of third-party sales teams, or if that management may be we're going to get rid of third-party business originators and generators. And so the DOJ will take that information in, and they'll see perhaps multiple companies use it. They will call it out as a point for a plus for the company, if for lack of a more precise term. But it's an evolution, and it's not simply the DOJ on high pronouncing. It's not simply Tom Fox and Mike DeBernardis saying, we came up with this idea, you really ought to do this. It's almost a dialogue. And I really wanted to get your thoughts on the role of someone like you and your colleagues at Hughes Hubbard, kind of working with companies who find themselves in trouble, bringing ideas to the DOJ, and the DOJ saying, well, try it, or yeah, you've tried it and we've seen the data and we like the results and and we're going to give you credit for it. Could you maybe comment on that sort of give and take process of outside counsel like yourself in the Department of Justice for the compliance professional?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's one we've discussed before. I think with specific to this trend, I don't think you can call it anything other than a trend, because we never saw it before, and we've now seen it, 4 times in the last 6 months, of companies making changes to not just better mitigate their risks by putting compliance enhancements in place, but completely change their risks, right? So if you have been engaged in a corruption scheme involving third-party agents, one potential remediation step is to say, we're going to really enhance our due diligence process and monitoring of third-party agents, and that mitigates your risk. The other is to say, I want to take out this risk. This is not worth it anymore. We're going to fundamentally change our risk profile, and we're going to remove third-party agents entirely. And now when you're looking at relative risk to the company, you're juggling what's now your riskiest area. Obviously, companies are learning from each other. I think there's some advocacy that has been done by lawyers for these companies with the DOJ to sort of set the stage for this. To say, not only has our client done all this great remediation, enhanced our training and added compliance resources, and we are so serious about being a different company today than we were back then, that we're eliminating an entire business practice. One that, by the way, in most cases is successful, right? The reasons companies use third-party agents is because it's a successful way to generate business. We are going to eliminate that so that we don't have to worry about that risk anymore. And I am certain that the lawyers for these companies, when talking to the DOJ, have played that up and done it fairly well to make sure that their clients have gotten really full credit for it. And you also can't discount the role something like that can have on the decision to have a monitor as well. And then we live in a copycat world where one company sees it being done successfully, and the next will do the same. But yeah, it's absolutely those are the conversations you want to have as external counsel. Is here's your expectation that we're going to do X, Y, and Z to remediate. We're doing more than that. One of my favorite things to be able to say to a regulator is the company that you're looking at from 2015 is fundamentally different than the one today. The people, the leadership are different. We've got new compliance officers, and our risk profile is different because we're doing things differently in terms of our business practices. That is one, to me, one of the most impactful conversations to have as outside counsel when you're going through these conversations.
Mike, I've been saving this quote up to use in this podcast. So I'm going to read it to you and maybe get your thoughts on it. It comes from Acting Assistant Attorney General Nicole Argentaria and the speech she gave at the ABA White Collar Conference in March, where she said following, quote, "As part of their resolutions with the criminal division, each of these trading companies was required to make critical enhancements to their compliance programs to prevent future violations of the FCPA. Companies that take forward-leaning steps on compliance will be better well-positioned to certify that they have met their compliance obligations at the end of their term of their agreements, as now required by corporate resolutions with this criminal division. These prosecutions also help the tone for energy trading companies as a whole. They show that a robust compliance function is critical." And it just struck me, that phrase, forward-leaning steps, that the department really credits companies that do exactly what you just described. The company you saw in 2015 is not the company in 2024. And the impact that whether it's measurable under the corporate enforcement policy in terms of a discount or just sets a tone, but it seems like this is something that is persuasive to the DOJ. And now I heard Nicole Argentaria actually say that as something that matters. And maybe in this podcast, with your thoughts on her statement.
Amen. right? I mean, it's it's exactly right. I think it's something that we have been telling clients, that many other outside counsel have been telling clients, that this is a successful strategy to achieve the best result. And so, it's great to hear that again, sort of emphasized by the DOJ itself, that we want to see companies being proactive and forward leaning and forward looking in their remediation. And frankly, she didn't say it, but I think it's in there, creative, right? But really, kind of checking the boxes. We're going to do more training. We're going to add advisory resources is one thing, but really thinking about what company we want to be today and 5 years from now. Those things are valued.
Well, Mike, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. Always a pleasure. I really enjoyed this episode and look forward to continuing our conversation.
Thanks, Tom. Good to be on.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the award-winning All Things Investigation. We've linked to the Hughes Hubbard website in our show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. I hope you will join us again for our next episode of All Things Investigations. All Things Investigations is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.